So I'll kick off. I'll kick off by introducing myself. Those of you who are regulars to the Mint House probably won't recognise me. My name's Katie. I am the interim chief exec of the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But just to give you a few basic house rules, so we're going to be together for about an hour and a half today. This will be recorded. So for the recording, we'll mostly be recording the speaker, so your image won't show up. But if you do come on the mic to speak, or both your voice and your image will be recorded. So just to make you aware of that. And that's when we're all together in the room, not when we break out into smaller groups. But we'd really encourage you to keep your camera on if you're able, so we can see who's in the room, so you can see each other. That's a real encouragement to speakers and participants. There will be chances today to ask questions, and you can do that either through the raise your hand function, or you can put it in the chat. We don't have the Q&A function on this call, so it will be the chat if you've got a particular question. And if you're part of the webinar and you've got a good answer, or you can signpost a resource, do please feel free to put in your own responses in the chat as well. And we've got Joy keeping an eye out for anything that comes through. So you're really welcome to this session today, where we're thinking about campaigning without polarisation. How can I contribute to a better world without further fracturing society? And there are three speakers today, and I'm going to introduce the other two to you first. So Pete, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pete Wallis. I have just retired in November from 25 years working in restorative justice in Oxfordshire's Youth Justice Service. And I'm also founding trustee of the Mint House.
Thanks very much, Pete. And Becks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Becks. Very nice to meet you. Happy New Year. I am a former British diplomat, and I was posted to conflict zones mainly, so the Balkans, Darfur and Afghanistan, and was involved to some extent with the government peace negotiations in those countries. And then since then, I've left the Foreign Office and become an accredited mediator, and sort of focused more on the emotional and psychological aspects of conflict mediation, including doing work in the community.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got some people that are helping with some of the facilitation in our breakout rooms today. They weren't expecting this, but Joy, would you be able to say hi?
Hi, I'm Joy Bettles. I'm the Communication and Events Officer at the Mint House. So you probably will have had emails from me about this event, and it's great to see you all.
Brilliant. And Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex James. I'm Head of Programmes at the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, so also one of the facilitators in the group stuff later.
And I believe we've got one more person, Joy, and the name has gone.
Yes, Abby, if you are around and able to say hi.
Abby, hi.
Otherwise.
Yeah, hi. My name is Abby. I am the Projects and Training Coordinator at the Mint House.
Brilliant, thank you. So for those of you who have just joined the room, a really big welcome to today's session. We've just introduced the speakers that you'll have, but we do really encourage you to be active and involved in the space today. There will be a recording, so you can kind of look back and review what's going on, and some further resources as well available for you as we go forward. So my task is just to set the scene a little bit for this conversation. As I said, my name's Katie. I was lucky enough to do a little bit of work with the Mint House a few years ago, which is where the relationship started, but have recently taken over as the interim chief exec for the Sheila McKechnie Foundation since last March. And for those of you who don't know SMK, we are there to support and champion and connect anyone involved in campaigning and social change. So I guess the information that I'm sharing with you now about how this issue affects campaigning comes from over 20 years of experience of working with individuals in campaigning at all different levels, whether it be internal advocacy and government engagement, local community mobilising, and on a range of issues as well. So we're not issue specific. It could be gender justice, poverty, race, climate. If you're involved in trying to make social change happen through campaigning, then SMK is there to support. So this particular conversation about how we campaign in a way that doesn't further polarize comes, I guess, in my mind, it really kind of came to the front when I was at a workshop with Professor Marshall Gantz in the summer. And we were looking at how NGOs and charities use the power of organising to make change happen. And we started sort of taking the temperature in the room. And what this group of seasoned activists and campaigners were talking about were all sorts of issues, from kind of resilience, changing government. But the thing that struck me most was, how can we campaign in a way that causes the least harm to the most vulnerable? So if we have a campaign win, if we make a policy change happen or a local decision happen, but actually those that are most marginalised in society are worse off, then is that really a campaign win? No. Or if a change happens in a local environment, but then perhaps a bigger issue comes along and the relationships are so fragmented that your starting point in terms of building a new narrative or working towards a good change is just almost impossible because of that breakdown. You've ended up with a weaker community through the campaigning rather than a stronger one. And we're really interested at SMK in campaigns that actually strengthen community, that strengthen that social fabric, that makes good social change happens. So it's a really humbling reminder that our efforts for social change do mend, but they also tear the fabric of society. And the consequences of the campaigning that we do are often unpredictable and often far-reaching. Now, I guess I also want to start with the inherent challenge in some of the language that we use around campaigning. So those of you who love your words will know that the root of campaigning is a military one, meaning continued or sustained aggressive operations for the accomplishment of some purpose. Now, over time, the word campaign moved into the political space and also into the marketing space as well. And it was around achieving a significant goal. But there's still quite a lot of lingerings of some of that terminology that's associated with that aggression and that militancy. The language is really important because it shows up in the models we teach and the tools that we use. And I just want to share a historic, now we've updated it since, tool that we use at SMK, or we had used at SMK to train. And this is a stakeholder mapping tool here. I'm hoping that you can see. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Joy. So we've got a normal grid here. We've got a line down the middle looking at campaign targets, whether they have more or less influence, and then the horizontal line looking at whether they agree with us or not. And I guess I want to pull three things out of this model that instantly may lead or contribute to polarization. So first of all, that horizontal line is very personal. They strongly, the people strongly agree with us, the people on the other side. Since then, we've changed the language now to align with our cause. We've tried to depersonalize it a little bit. It's really important to know what policy positions, what organisations might be on common ground with you. But this model makes it very personal. The second thing I want to draw attention to is just the imagery. So if you strongly agree with us, you're a lovely green person and you're holding hands and it's all very lovely. And on the other side, we've got a quite furious red face. And there is absolutely space for fury and rage in campaigning, particularly with significant issues around social justice. But this very depiction already kind of draws apart the nice communities we want to work with and the rage furious ones we're against. And the last one, which you've probably already spotted, is the activity that comes as a result of that. So in the quadrant in the top left, you've got our active allies, so those with loads of influence and they strongly agree with us. In the quadrant opposite on the top right, you've got those that have loads of influence that strongly disagree with us, and our action is we need to neutralise. Now, I don't know what that neutralisation, sort of what form that's taken shape over the years. We've now changed it to risk mitigation. Obviously, there's a problem there if you do want to make a particular change happen. But the language implies almost an annihilation of someone or something or a group that doesn't agree with us. So I just wanted to use that as a little bit of an example to show how we don't help ourselves in terms of strengthening community sometimes in the tools that we use. So I'm just going to pull that down. This is where my 3-screen juggle is not helping me. Here we go. And there we go. Okay, so just sort of mentioning how we can contribute towards polarisation. And I wanted to pick up on a few trends that we've also seen in the work and research we do around campaigning. And some of these will probably feel very familiar with you, to you, in terms of the context where we're trying to make social change happen. So the first is a move away from the relational. And this is over long periods of time. You might think about kind of the nostalgia of I used to know all my neighbours, now I don't. I used to know my MP and my doctor, now I don't. But an idea that because of the amount of people we have contact with, a lot of the streamlining that happens in managing all those different contacts means that there are less opportunities to be relational, to form that trust and to build meaningful contacts with people. The second thing I would draw attention to is what I'm describing as the breakdown of social contract. So if we describe social contract as the norms, these could be written or unwritten rules by which people are expected to behave. So in a school environment, you might actually have those written down. It used to be the case that it was unacceptable for politicians to lie. I would say that social contract has been severely tested in recent years. So it's that idea that those sort of norms of decency, of honesty, can't be taken for granted anymore. The third one I want to draw attention to is around communication and competition. And I'm not out to get any marketing or comms people here, but we are increasingly told to use less words, to take less time to say what we mean, and to focus on a really competitive space where we have to grab attention if we want to engage people. And that really robs us of the opportunity to bring nuance, to take people on a journey, or give people space and time to form their own opinions. So that's number 3. Number 4, good old social media, echo chambers and algorithms. We are less likely in those spaces to come across content different to our own opinions, which both reinforces our position, but also removes that opportunity for stretch and growth unless we go out looking for it. Next one is a biggie, and it's a bit of a hangover from the Industrial Revolution. So this is a wide-ranging one, but it's around the myth of rational man. So a lot of our economics are based on the idea that we're logical people that make decisions based on facts. But if any of you have been involved in any kind of community engagement work or just interacted with people, you'll know that's not true. But it's still often the underlying principle when we think about how we work through a particular problem. And the last one is perhaps the biggest and also the most challenging, but is the belief that change is possible, that politics work. And that has a really significant effect on how much effort and how much willingness there is to engage in a conversation that might test our ideas, that might change our thinking, or just engage at all in a project that is there to make social change happen. So that's some of the background as to why we think polarisation in campaigning is quite an easy place to land, but it's not where we want to land. So I'm going to hand over now to Pete to share a little bit about how restorative justice might help.
Okay. What I thought I'd do in good restorative fashion is, rather than tell you what restorative or restorative justice or restorative practice is, but I would ask you, which is a bit challenging because there's a lot of you, but I just wondered if you'd be willing to type into the chat a brief, could just be a word, it could be a little phrase, a thought, it could be an image, something that you feel captures or sums up something you know. There's no wrong answers here, by the way. So, don't worry if you're absolutely new to it and you never heard the word restorative, you thought it was about dentistry before you came here, but just stick something in there. I won't be able to sort of read them all out or respond to them all. Beautiful. Mutual respect, active listening, empathy, understanding, forgiveness, common ground, finding common ground, moving people together, accountability and empathy, connecting with compassion, peace, understanding, listening with curiosity and without judgment, community, compassion and love, taking responsibility again, reconciliation. We've got empathy again, building understanding, finding ways to reduce harm, valuing diversity of thought. That is an absolutely beautiful list. Setting relations right, non-punitive, trying to move closer together. It almost feels like it's an antidote to what Katie's been talking about. Long-term change enables the hurt people community to communicate their pain to the aggressor without causing harm to either. Beautiful. Well, I hope you'll have a chance to kind of, enjoy those words and those themes, and I absolutely chime with all of them. So I don't know whether some of you have come across restorative justice or restorative practice in particular contexts, but some of the terminology is a bit confusing. Restorative justice is kind of where it all started, with the idea of trying to work where there's been conflict. And often people in the restorative justice community reflect back on indigenous forms of reconciliation and justice. For example, healing circles in Canada, where there was, issues around sexual abuse. So a lot of this can be identified from many different parts of the world, from Australia, New Zealand, from Canada. The people link it also with the truth and reconciliation type processes, for example, in East Timor or Rwanda or South Africa, which have lots of common themes, where you're kind of giving the problem back to the people whose problem it is, and supporting them in finding a safe space to move forward and find their own solution. So it's all about relationships. Katie talked about the tearing the fabric of society, and I think restorative practice is about mending and restoring that fabric thread by thread. So it's not a quick win. And we talked in the chat there about being non-punitive. It's a kind of no blame approach. But there is this idea of accountability as well, and responsibility that we all share. So what I'm going to do is just share a particular model of restorative practice, which I like, which was distilled by a wonderful person, Dr. Belinda Hopkins, who works in the youth setting, particularly in schools. She's an author and the director of an organization called Transforming Conflict. Worth a look at her website. And she developed 5 themes. And I think the way this worked is that back in the when I started really in early 2000s, in restorative justice, it started off particularly in the adult sphere with probation. The police and the probation services came up with a kind of format for bringing people where there had been an extreme conflict, a crime, particularly more serious crimes, into the room to try and find a resolution and a way forward. And that's a very challenging thing to do. And if you go back to this idea of there being a tear in the fabric of society, well, a serious crime is a major tear. And those people there's such a gap between them. Often the people they were working with in those early days were the person who caused the harm might be in prison. The person who had been harmed might feel a prisoner in their own home because they might feel unsafe going out. And the police and the probation service developed a kind of scripted model to help the facilitators guide that conversation. And what Belinda Hopkins very, very cleverly did was to use that scripted model, which was kind of honed over many, many decades, and think about what questions were being asked and why. And then she came up with 5 themes. So I'm going to share the screen now, or Joy's going to share it for me. And we're just going to chew over these 5 themes and see if any of this relates to our topic today around campaigning. So the 5 restorative themes and questions. Next. Theme 1. We've kind of touched on this already, and I think Katie sort of alluded to the fact we're not here looking about facts. We're talking about perspectives, really. And if you want to learn about another person's perspective, then this is a challenging bit, I think, for campaigners. absolutely the starting point is to listen. So there's a lot of emphasis in restorative practice about active listening and really going against what you want to do, which is to tell people what the answer is or what the solution is or what the problem is, and starting point being to listen. Next, please. Yeah. So what happened? What's happening? And I think theme two. So it's all about listening to understand rather than listening to reply. And we are trying. There's a lot in restorative practice about stories and storytelling and the power of listening to people's stories and how issues that are of huge concern to them relate to their lives. And then by doing that, you may be able to find common values where actually you realize that you're not so far apart after all. But the power of listening is also, Katie was talking about kind of everything speeding up really and getting a bit shouty. And restorative practice and restorative justice is about slowing things down and also less about kind of sound bites, because if you start exploring with people what happened, what's their perspective, what's their story, what's their narrative, what they were thinking, how they're feeling, you then there's this nice phrase that I heard. It's kind of thickening the dialogue. So rather than just being that quick social media thing, you are slowing everything down and really giving time to really important issues that are important for people's lives. And it also, there's a big emphasis in restorative practice about language and being thoughtful and careful about language. Just looking at theme two for a minute, you can't deny someone else's feelings. So if someone's saying they're feeling angry or they're feeling hurt or they're feeling sad, that's their inner world, isn't it? That's their inner life. So you're kind of on safe space, really talking, and then you can chip in with your own feelings about something. So if you're talking about the climate, for example, you might, having listened first, be able to sort of share. I was brought up from the pram, really, going on campaigning marches, including in Aldermaston back in the day, and I was at an XR demo about 6 years ago. And by far the best bit of this whole weekend was when a very angry man shouted that we got it all wrong. And he was quite aggressive and absolutely fuming. And, he wanted to make a point. And I, I was quite intimidated, but I decided just to sort of try and see what he was, where he was coming from. And I kind of got into step with him, and he was storming away from the demonstration. And I was determined just to sort of start off with him and listen to him. Anyway, I'm sure many of you have had that same experience where an hour and a half later, I'd had the most amazing and beautiful conversation with this young man who had a heart of gold. We had so much common ground. He just felt that the way it was being conveyed on this march was the wrong way. He had his own ideas about that. So that was a reminder to me that, it's always those conversations and often the individual conversations that feel the best for me. Next slide. You probably heard of the ripple effect, but the idea really is that all of our actions ripple out, whether they're sort of harmful actions or positive actions. It's like ripples when you throw a brick into a pond. And for me, this is just a reminder that everything we do and how we do it kind of conveys a message. And I think restorative practice is quite good that we do reflect on how we are and how we do it. It's almost like a sort of mindset or a way of being that you kind of embody it. And I think in campaigning, it's really helpful if you try and avoid some of the pitfalls that, for example, peace organizations that are, full of conflict, full of internal conflict. So if you have, if you have ways of making sure that your relationships within your campaigning group are really positive ones, and ways to, resolve conflict in healthy ways, I think that's where I'd be coming from with theme 3, and recognizing that everything that we do kind of just carries on rippling out. We're all connected. We're all so interconnected. Another campaigning group that I'm involved in at the moment, Fossil Free Oxfordshire, is campaigning to encourage the local government pension scheme to divest from fossil fuel investments. And we've tried everything. And I think we've come to the conclusion that kind of scare tactics or kind of lecturing isn't always our sort of strong point. And building relationships with the key players, particularly the committee where the ultimate responsibility lies, is the way to go. So we have now become a kind of critical friend with those councillors and building relationships with them. And I feel it's difficult to, it's always difficult to know what's made the difference, but I feel, there's been a massive change in their approach over the 10 years. Next. Thanks. So looking at needs, and this is based on the work of Marshall Rosenberg. I don't know if Joy, you can go on to the next slide and then back again. Again, what do we need? And this is a nice sort of safe ground to explore with someone if you're trying to, have a dialogue, basically, about any issue, really, particularly where there's disagreement or conflict. And I like to think of these as sort of safe stepping stones, really, for the last theme, which you probably guess is where do we go from here? Because these are universal human needs. And if you can get down to the level of these, then you can agree. For example, the young man who I had the conversation with at the XR demo, a lot of these ones, it's safe ground. We could talk about fairness, a sense of fairness. What does that look like? When have you experienced that? Reassurance, support, optimism. They're kind of, it feels like it's a really positive conversation that you can do. And recognizing that often if you're having a challenging conversation and you're starting off from a point of disagreement, if you're challenging someone, their defense is going to rise very, very quickly. And the amount of time you've got before they stop listening and stop being able to hear is draining away rapidly. And somehow, if you can get to that common ground, that common theme that we all share, then you have a better chance of keeping the conversation going and exploring theme 5. So if you could go on to the next one, Joy. Thanks. And I guess with theme 5, this is a kind of holy grail of campaigning, I guess, really, isn't it? To help the people that you're in dialogue with to identify the problem themselves and then to be the ones coming up with the solution. And that is challenging, isn't it? But restorative justice comes from such challenging conflicts. I talked about the truth and reconciliation, the healing circles, the sort of quite grave crimes that people have come together to try and find common ground and try and find all of those beautiful things you talked about at the beginning, ways to reduce harm, to generate empathy, to value diversity of thought, to build understanding and find long-term change. So that's kind of where we would love to get to in a campaign, I guess. I'm going to stop talking now because I've said an awful lot, but I've got a few minutes before my little time is gone. If anyone wants to put their hand up and make a comment or ask a question, or please take this opportunity now just before we move on to the next part of the workshop. Any thoughts, anything that's resonated, anything you disagree with? Any new ideas? That's a good question. How do you factor in bad actors, especially around climate. One of the things that I find interesting in the fossil-free Oxfordshire is that, and I think with other campaigning groups, is that you sometimes get people who have kind of been involved in that industry and are kind of, have seen the light. And how can you encourage other people to make that kind of journey? Do speak out if anyone wants to put their hand up. And any thoughts on that question about bad actors? I think that's a really challenging one. Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
Thanks, Peter. I really enjoyed that. Just responding to that, thoughts on bad actors, I suppose something that I've been working on and sort of seeking to do is to differentiate the act from the actor, and to be much more comfortable with the idea of that there's an action that perhaps we're philosophically safe to categorize as a bad one, but that thinking in terms of actors being inherently themselves bad is part of the polarization that I've been sort of increasingly troubled by. Thanks.
Thank you. I think what Abby says about does restorative practice have more to say about how we prepare a campaign. I think I'm hoping that from this we'll sort of think it might be relevant for both, but certainly in terms of how you work internally within your campaigning organisation, I think that restorative practice has an awful lot to say about how healthy organisations, healthy relationships, building a culture of respect and empathy, and having clear techniques for resolving conflict and enabling different voices to be heard, and making sure that there aren't people who feel left out or are marginalised. So I think there's an awful lot about the preparation and the kind of internal part of the group, but I also I'm being curious about what we can learn from restorative practice in terms of the campaigning as well.
Pete, just to add in terms of the life cycle of a campaign, I think one thing we're really curious about is what happens after the campaign. So I think we do quite a lot of work in helping teams evaluate whether it's been successful. But traditionally, that doesn't take into account how we've left those relationships, the strength, the ability to go back and build on those networks, who we might engage next time. Would people work with us again? That's not necessarily usually part of it. So I think, also looking at the end, so that assuming that the issue is not resolved, a lot of us are working on big global intersectional issues. We probably will have to come back to them. So that end piece is really interesting to us as well.
I guess sometimes it's about disagreeing well, isn't it? Or agreeing to disagree. I've come to the end of my time. Thank you, everyone, for your really rich thoughts. And I'm now going to pass over to Becks.
Thank you all. I noticed that Anthea, you had your hand up. Do you want to just speak, or should we, Katie, Joy, what should we do? Should we just carry on and come back to that?
Yeah, Anthea, if you're happy to bring that back later, maybe at the end of Beck's portion, or maybe even later when we have a larger discussion later, then feel free to chip in then.
Great, thanks. So thanks, Pete. There's, in a way, what I'm going to do now is try to put some practical kind of methodology around what Pete's just talked about, really. And it is very much about a process of active listening, in a way that we trialled it in Oxford, on a particular issue around low traffic neighbourhoods in Oxford, which you probably know. It's when a policy was brought in by the local council where you sort of block a road and try to create areas where cars move less freely, and then some main thoroughfares where cars move more freely. That happened in Oxford during COVID, and it really, really led to a lot of polarisation. Some people very strongly in support of the policy, others very strongly against. And social media went crazy and extremely polarised. Local print media took one side very strongly. What we noticed were there was no place, either in person or online, where people with very different perspectives could listen to each other and understand the other view. So what Katie was talking about was, very evident here locally. So what myself and a team from the university tried to do was to run a few reflective listening processes with people who strongly felt very much in support of low traffic neighbourhoods or very much against. So people had middle feelings in the middle where that wasn't, this process wasn't for them, but it was for people who had very strong views and people who were willing to listen to the other side. And the whole process was not about trying to change anyone's minds. So someone in the comments said, is there a way of doing restorative justice without having a one-to-one conversation? Well, this actually is a methodology that involves a one-to-one conversation. So maybe we can come back to that question later. But this maybe will just put a bit of practical meat on the bones of what Pete has been talking about. I'm just going to check. So basically, the format was that it lasted 60 to 90 minutes. We created an in-person meeting. It was very warm and informal and always in local venues that were close to everybody. And I was the mediator, and it needed a lot of careful, sort of thoughtful care, holding, because a lot of people were very nervous coming to the interaction. There had been, these bollards had been chainsawed down, they'd been burnt down, and driven over, and then when they'd been removed, humans who supported the LTNs would go and stand as a human bollard in the road to stop the cars coming through. And sometimes there'd been altercations, physical altercations with cars speeding up to the humans standing in the road. So there's been quite a lot of sort of physical fear as well involved. So it was definitely a heightened situation. Oh, and Panorama did a little program, included some of this in a program they did. So a lot of people coming to these events were quite nervous because they hadn't had a positive conversation about LTNs with someone else. So what we did was asked a series of questions, initially very structured. I timed the response from the first participant, and then the other person reflected back what they had heard. So it was, as Pete says, it's listening to understand rather than listening to reply. So one person, I would ask a question like, when you see a bollard, what do you feel? One person would respond to 2 minutes, the other person would reflect what they had heard and not comment on it. And then the roles would flip. And we did that generally after 20 to 30 minutes of a series of questions. People started to relax and feel that they were being respected in their view. Their sort of defenses dropped. And the conversation started to flow more fluidly, and it didn't need as tight facilitation because the trust had been built. What we're working here basically with, again, Pete touched on it, is when people feel respected and understood in their perspective, their defenses drop and they're able, actually the brain activates, different parts of the brain activate. So it's kind of physiological response, and their ability to be receptive to other views and to open actually changes. So it's a sort of, it's a brain, the neurochemistry changes. So but that's something that we're all doing every day, but we're just kind of working with that process. So what we found, running a series of the listening exchanges, was that basically the people said that they understood where the other person was coming from. No one changed their opinion, and that wasn't the aim, but everyone, without exception, said that they understood where the other person was coming from. And it's mainly about prejudices and stereotypes just falling away. So generally, most people thought the other side was sort of ignorant and stupid and selfish. And then when they sat there in front of the other person who was talking from their lived experience, not their sort of opinion or sort of what the evidence said, but lived experience. Again, you can't comment, disagree with what someone feels. You might not agree with the interpretation they've put on it, but you can't contest what they say they're feeling. People felt that, the stereotypes just melted away. And what we were able to do was draw out the values underneath the positions, according to Marshall Rosenberg's model of nonviolent communication, and people then could connect at the values that were understand the positions, and often the values were the same. So freedom was fairness, was a very important value. Both sides thought the policy was very unfair in some ways and fair in others. And when each person heard the other person's reasons why they thought that, there was a connection, because at least everyone cared about fairness. So people said things like, and the other very important thing was that in the context of this situation was that people felt heard And one man, for example, he asked the first question, when you see a bollard, what do you feel? And he kind of answered, but it kind of mulled over. He was mulling it over for the whole process of the listening exchange. And then towards the end, he suddenly said, oh, I've got it. He became quite animated. He said, I've got it. When I see a bollard, it means I don't matter. So basically, there was quite a complex sort of emotional, psychological thing going on for him. And he was just seeing as being invalidated and being sort of walked all over. So him having someone receive that and get it was really quite a powerful thing. So that's the kind of level at which these things were operating. A quote that someone said, I think I'm more resolved to be positive and not so negative, not immediately categorizing somebody because they're that type of person, or from that point of view, or from that initial cultural framework. So that's what someone said after having gone through the listening exchange. Another quote was, it was very good, very nice to have this space to talk in a kind of trusted environment where you can relate a bit and know that your views are valuable as anybody else's. So that's the kind of thing that people were coming out with. So how might this be relevant in a campaigning context where obviously you're pushing for a particular outcome? Well, what we found with the listening exchanges was that as you start to, the people connect on a human level, the conversation becomes more healthy and productive, and they start really clarifying where they do agree and where they really don't agree. And there's so much confusion and hot air and energy out there that starts to fall away very quickly. They start to realize more concretely and usefully on the values and the deeper level on which they disagree, which is helpful. And fairly quickly in our exchanges, we became clear there's masses of overlap. And just to get practical for a minute, because I think it helps explain the situation, it emerged that a lot of people, everybody agreed, whether they are on the pro or anti-LTNs, very strongly agreed that it was the school drop-off and pick-up points which are the main problems for car congestion. There was 2 big roads that got massively congested at those times. There was one school at the bottom of those 2 big roads, and everyone agreed that if the 60 or 70 parents, each driving their child to the school down those roads, could instead drop them at the park and ride on the ring road outside Oxford, and a bus could bring all those kids in, you'd get those 60, 70 plus cars off the road during drop-off and pick-up times for the schools. And everyone agreed with that policy. So if we had been turning this into a campaign approach, what we could have done, and we didn't because it wasn't our remit, but what one could do is then create a joint campaign. I mean, this, between people who strongly agree with LTNs, strongly disagree with LTNs, they could write a joint letter, go to the head teacher of that school and ask for this bus to be collecting the pupils and dropping them off outside the ring road of Oxford. And if one wanted, you could do a social media and a sort of website around all of that to show that people with different views are campaigning in a similar way. So that's one potential practical way for this conversation that we've got today. I mean, it's quite an extreme, version of it. If to the lesser extent, how might such a thing be useful for people who are in campaigning organisations? Well, if we really understanding the perspective of the person with a different view to oneself, just having that emotional connection with them and the respect for their position, even though you continue to strongly disagree, what we've found is that it does start to change the way you think about that person, think about those people, and starts to change the way you talk about them, not in their presence, change the social media posts, change the thinking behind actions to take and potential policy positions to advocate for. So that sort of softer behaviour change does seem to be happening, and actually we're going to start doing some more research on that at the university to really try to evidence that. But those are my 2 kind of suggestions in terms of how this might practically be helpful for those in campaign organisations. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and any questions. Oh, thank you, Joy. Joy has put in the chat our paper that covers this. We did the research at the University in Oxford with the Global Centre on Healthcare and Urbanisation. Thanks, Joy.
Great. Thanks so much,
Back to you now,
Beck.
Katie. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm sure that all of you will have a lot of thoughts and potentially some feelings on what we've already shared today, both in what Pete and Bex, and to be honest, what Katie has shared to kick us off as well. So we really want to now move into a space where we can actually hear from you and think about this in a more collective sense. I'm aware that there's been a lot of talk today about restorative practice and sort of outlining some principles of restorative practice and having listening dialogues. But we're also aware that those of you who are involved sort of actively in campaigning may have some questions about, okay, well, how would this work, or would it work at all in the sort of environments that you operate in regularly? So we're going to move into some breakout rooms to have some smaller group discussions on this, that we can really sort of start to grapple with some of those questions and some of those issues that might be on your minds. So in a moment, I'll send everyone out to those groups. A little pop-up should come up asking you to join the group if you just click that. I'll also hang around in case anyone has any issues joining a group, and I can manually add you to a group. In these groups, we're going to spend 25 minutes, so there should hopefully be a decent amount of time to have a really good discussion. And hopefully give everyone a chance to contribute. So if everyone can go to those groups ready to contribute, but also listen to others and what sort of they're thinking about this. I have already prepped some kind of facilitators who will help to lead those groups, and they're aware of these questions, but just so the rest of you know, the two questions we'll be looking at are where is this happening already as part and parcel of campaigning? So some of these sort of principles from restorative practice that Pete was sharing earlier, things like listening with curiosity without judgment, thinking about everyone having a unique perspective, understanding harms, thinking about underlying needs and working together to find solutions. So where is this happening already? And then kind of secondly, how, if at all, do you think this might work in a campaigning context, and specifically in the context that you're working in? What are some of the positives? What do you think this might bring to campaigning? And also what are the challenges? What are some areas where you think this might not easily work, or you might come up against some issues in sort of implementing some of these ideas? So if you just give me one moment, I'll get the Zoom rooms ready and we'll send you all off to those groups, and then we'll come back at 1:10 to have a kind of a larger group discussion to continue to have a bit of a question and answer and think about some of these themes. Hello everyone and welcome back. I think everyone is back in the main room now, so I hope you had some good discussions. I'm sorry if you got cut off at the end there, but I hope you had some useful discussions about these topics. We are not going to do any sort of granular feedback on what you discussed, but I was wondering if those of you who were facilitating those groups, if any of you have any particular points that you thought were really pertinent that you would like to raise. Rosie.
Yeah, well, our group had really interesting things to say about the importance of people feeling there's a fair process, and the importance of language and supporting a shift of language from being accusatory to being comfortable with talking about feelings, and the fact that people managing campaigns need to be comfortable with that shift of language. And that's not a task of an instant, it's a long-term thing. We also had I suppose a question that I think it was reflected by someone in the chat before we went into our breakout rooms, which is how you get from the one-on-one conversations of the sort that Becks described to have a larger number of people in a room. So the question of getting people into the room who are willing to listen. We'd be interested to have Beck's further reflections on that, how you scale that up. Thank you.
Becks, do you have any thoughts on that initially that you might have to mind?
Yeah, so the scaling up issue, and this seems like a resource intensive process for very small organizations. It also came up in our group. Specific to what Rosie was just saying, how you get a wider number of people in the room. With this kind of approach, the intimacy is really important to build the trust. And then we need more people to be exposed to that intimacy and to start to go on the same emotional journey. So one method you could use is the goldfish bowl. So you have two people in the middle going through the listening exchange process, surrounded by a circle of people outside witnessing it. And if those two people in the middle are willing to be honest enough and genuinely not play to the audience, there's a tension there, but people often can do that, then that's one way of trying to scale it up. Another way is to record them and share them with a group of people. So I'll put in the chat in a minute a project where a mediator in the States is doing this. It's called the Enemies Project, and he has recorded a whole series of, he doesn't call them listening exchanges, but they're a similar process on the most contentious issues of the moment, and they're all out on YouTube. So that's one way he is doing it. Another way to scale up the influence that came up in our group was if you have some people that you're trying to represent their interests and they're quite a sort of the power dynamic, they're underpowered group, you could pair them with someone who has influence over the policy. So you target who has the most influence. That person might not be in a position of political influence. It might not be their position. They might have influence because they're extremely active online on this issue and having a lot of influence. But as part of your campaign profiling, you'll know who the influential people are anyway. So you can scale up, you can do listening exchanges with particular people of influence and might be able to maximize your impact that way.
Thank you. Those are some really practical and helpful suggestions. Any of the other facilitators, are there any other points that you think would be particularly relevant to share? Yeah, Katie.
Thanks, Joy. So we had a really great example at the beginning of doing it in practice that we sort of were able to dive down a little bit. But I think definitely that really practical, like what tools do we need? And the scaling question came up. But I think we also talked a little bit about the need for it internally within organisations. So we talk about a lack of diversity in campaigns planning, the fact that we might be sat in a room where, you know, you're almost complicit in you have to have a certain political view to be a campaigner to begin with. And actually it's very difficult to disagree if you maybe vote slightly differently or have a different leaning. So just sort of really naming that diversity and who's in the room doing the planning as well, and how we have different good conversations. Because I guess if we're role modeling it there, you know, we're able to, with legitimacy and more authenticity, take it out into the programs. And then particularly that challenge between that local opportunity, which is great to have conversations, have in-depth relationships, and that scaling. I think again, if the practice is there, it just, well, it's something we can do. And then we can kind of roll that out a little bit. And I think just also, like, regardless of the issue, and we represented different issues, we do all want people to feel like they can engage in campaigns. So that kind of shared ownership of every time someone's having a positive experience of being heard and being listened to. Yes, we're doing it for our organisations and our causes, but we're also contributing to something a little bit bigger, and we've got that common ground as well, being really important. But we will have a chance right at the end to think about what practical things people might need in the evaluation, I know. So if that's burning in your group, we're hoping to gather that so that we can act on that.
Are there any other thoughts on how we might take this approach forward in campaigning? I guess initially from the facilitators, again, if there's anything that has yet been raised that you want to bring, or anyone else, either put something in the chat or raise your hand to contribute. Are there ways that we think might work to sort of practically move forward with these ideas? Joe.
Yeah, thank you. Just reflecting really on something Katie just said, is that my sense is we could underestimate how important it is actually to practice getting good at being accountable and communicating effectively within our change-making organisations as part of the systems of interest that we want to influence. Because in my work now, I work with all kinds of organisations, have worked within many myself, where there's such a lot of internal conflict that is not being well managed or fully understood or fully kind of addressed, that I think maybe we underestimate how that negatively affects our ability to affect other parts of the system. We're like, well, we're doing good, and then this part of the system over here needs to change. And it's like, well, actually part of our effective campaigning might be to do more work closer to home, or at least part it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Abby, did you want to share something?
Yeah, just briefly feeding in from our group, I think we shared a lot of similar questions and and challenges, but just two things that I thought I'd highlight from the group, but to steal everyone else's ideas, was a question about pace. And so sometimes there's a tendency, especially in campaigning, that everything needs to be fast, like moving really quickly. Campaigns are quite short. And actually, there might be something in there about bringing everyone along for the ride. And even though the timescale might be much longer than what we might expect, it might be more ultimately effective, and sort of just brainstorming about what that could look like. And then another kind of idea challenge was about what does it look like to make inroads from a sort of opposing group. And maybe some people have some ideas of that, but it's one thing about having two people that have different perspectives, but another thing about like maybe an institution that might be quite an opposing institution, and what does it look like to make inroads for dialogue when obviously we're at odds with each other. We're directly campaigning against what that institution might uphold. So yeah, just two things there.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to come back to that question in a minute, Abby. So maybe start thinking on that, Pete and Bex, if you have any thoughts. But Anthea, I wanted to come to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is all totally brilliant. Thank you. I'm really, really appreciative of it all. One of the things that came up in our group was a question about dealing with companies, which we didn't have time to go into in the depth that it deserved. And it's got me thinking about the need to be strategic with this, because when we're treating people as humans with their very own reasons and motivations to be coming that we need to hear, we also need to look strategically at the structural situations in which they might find themselves working for companies whose bottom line is always going to be profit, and the limitations on that. Ditto, the question about bad actors that came up at the very beginning. When we're focusing on the people who are being influenced by the messages coming from those bad actors, yes, we need to do everything that we've all been talking about and hearing about here. And also there are some people whose motivations, their structures, their payoffs, who they're being funded by, there's a limit in how far we're going to go with them. So I think we need to stay conscious of the situation and the context in which we're having these conversations. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's helpful and a really interesting angle to think about. Pete and Bex, can I come to both of you? Can I guess for both of those questions and comments? I guess firstly that one on sort of how do we make inroads? How do we start trying to have dialogue with people who maybe have an opposing view to ourselves? And then also that question on companies and how we might relate to those who have a completely different way of operating, or also kind of big institutions like that as well, that it's not necessarily one individual that you'll be then I guess trying to convince. There's a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders involved. Do either of you have any thoughts on that you might be able to share?
I guess I'm interested in this area of challenge and how you go about challenging inappropriate behavior or harmful behavior, and how that relates to restorative practice in the broader sense as well. Because what we permit or what we allow persists. And I think that kind of edge where you need to kind of move from the kind of open listening to, the kind of calling out inappropriate behavior, and how you can do that in a way that the person who is being challenged can still hear. Because it's pointless kind of haranguing someone and telling them they're wrong or they're being harmful if they're not listening to that. That's, that you're not going to get anywhere with that. And I think that's a really, it's an area both in sort of individual human relationships, but also in the broader, campaigning relationships that we're talking about, how to do that skillfully, that sort of, challenge and calling out aspect. The other thing, I just wanted to ask actually, Anthea, because you shared a beautiful example of, and there have been one or two other examples of how this kind of campaigning is being done practically. Do you mind just saying a tiny little bit about that, Anthea? Because you put it up in the
Yeah, sure. I've just
chat.
posted the link. We're just a bunch of people in a community in South Devon who are out having conversations on the street. I guess you could describe it as deep canvassing. You'll see on the link there that we use a flip chart with a bunch of questions. The answers to the questions aren't really the point. People put stickers for yes, no, and question mark. It's really to open up conversations with people. and show that it is possible to have political discussions about difficult things on the street. I mean, yes, our underlying motive is we would like to reduce support for reform in some very reform-prone areas where they're making progress. But really, we want to. What we're realizing is so many people, they turn up and they're like, if you start on immigration, they're like, yes, I'm voting reform. That's what I'm doing. But as soon as you get into the questions about how they feel about things, the questions are designed to get to people's underlying values. And if we're listening carefully and not sort of hammering at them, like I used to do in my NGO campaigning life, we find all sorts of common ground, and we find that actually we're able to say by the end of the conversation, look, you think you're voting for reform, but actually, like, most of your views are not going in that direction. And we can start to sort of open up some gentle challenge, which comes about through people having been listened to and also being open to being challenged ourselves. I'm open to the fact that things may change in how I see things in those conversations. So I really recommend it, and please do get in touch. You can find my website easily if you know of any other projects like this, because we really want to talk to other people who are doing this. Thanks.
Bex, do you have anything else that you want to add? I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's anything else you think is useful in terms of engaging with people from an opposing perspective, or anything about that sort of engaging with corporations?
Yeah, I think it's probably already been said. Just briefly to say two things relevant maybe. This kind of approach is one method. There are other approaches as well in campaigning, and it's a sort of judicious use of what's appropriate and what isn't, so as not to increase polarization or to have maximum impact. So these methods are really useful in some circumstances. It's not saying that they have to be used for the whole of campaigning. And they can be, others can be used alongside. But I think that the sort of basic principle, as Anthea just set out, of really listening to people and understanding where someone is coming from and what's motivating them and what their needs and values are and why they're taking that position is a basic approach of respect. And even if someone is in a company and a structure and a whole set of structural things that push them in a certain direction, you can still approach them in that way and help them to understand what's going on for them. Who knows what effect that might have? It might be a tool that you choose to use in that situation, or it might be that you choose other tools in that situation.
Great, thank you. I've just seen that Duncan has put a suggestion in the chat that there's lots of good suggested reading that people have put in the chat, and says that it feels like we could use a common reading list or listening list sharing facility. If anyone wants to send me any links that I can compile together, I'm happy to put those into a follow-up email that I'll be sending either tomorrow, probably tomorrow, or definitely Wednesday. So if there's anything that you do want to share, anything that you think is relevant, any sort of books or links to other organisations or research that's been done, please do send those links to me, or references to me, and I can put them in that email tomorrow. So if you do that this afternoon, I can circulate that to everyone tomorrow to sort of share that with the group, because I'm aware that the chat can sort of move quickly. My email address is joy@minthouseoxford.co.uk. I'll put that in the chat in a moment. But otherwise, we're going to nearly run out of time, so I'm going to hand on to Katie to sort of wrap things up for us.
Thanks. So it falls to me just to say thank you so much for your conversations, for your chat, for your input. As Joy said, this week you'll get access to the recording and you'll get that list of resources which people have been so generous with. I'm just really grateful for the engagement. It's been really helpful and really refreshing for me as well to hear so much support for this kind of campaigning. And I'm just going to pop a quote in the chat, which is by American activist Valerie Kerr. And for those of you who are interested in really tough advocacy and campaigning on difficult issues in a way that humanises, she's an excellent example of that. And we talked right at the beginning, we had some questions about emotion. We've talked lots about acknowledging people's feelings. We talked about that sort of passion that often leads us to campaigning. But the way that she kind of talks about it is to not push down, or kind of, it's not about just being nice. It's about really connecting with what we care about. And she says this: "Now I understand my rage is loaded with information and energy. It connects me with my power to fight for others and myself. And these principles of leading with wonder, harnessing rage, listening with humanity, and reimagining a shared future are the means and the end." And I think that's really come across in our conversations today as well, that we have, yes, these individual journeys we want to go on, but actually that end is that humanized engagement that builds a great and strong community. So I leave that with you. I'm also just going to share really quickly a slide. If you're going to get a whole load of information about other Mint House events. I know there's some brilliant things coming up, some dates to be confirmed. But if you're interested in any campaigning training with Sheila McKechnie, we're just about to start our campaigns carousel. All the details on our website, and Alex will put the thing in the chat. But anything from kind of resilience to comms to evaluation to all those tactical things, as well as learning from peers in our action learning sets, we'd love to see you there as well. So yeah, thank you to our guest speakers. Thanks to Pete and Bex and Abby and Alex and Joy for the facilitation. And I hope you have a really brilliant week. Thank you, everyone.